So today let's talk a little bit about what I've termed the old internet or internet anarchy. I actually brought this up in a previous video a little bit when I talk about the smartphone revolution. So if you want to sort of get a primer for what I'm talking about, then watch that video also. So what is the old internet, and when did it come to be, and when did it stop being, etc. So first of all, when I talk about the old internet, I mean approximately the time from the 90s to the to some date in the 2000s. Now, because the internet has developed in a sort of progressive way, and it didn't like shift from the old internet to the new internet that we are now using in one go, but rather it's sort of slowly over year shifted into this direction. So I would say that the old internet is the internet of the 90s and the early 2000s, but there is no exact date for when it sort of when it ceased to be, with the caveat that the smartphones were the last nail to the coffin of the old internet. So after the smartphones, it definitely didn't exist, but I can tell you the exact date when the old internet ceased to be. So there's like many differences between the old and the new internet that I want to talk about. But first, let's talk about how it was used. So, or how you used it. So you, generally speaking, connected to the internet on a modem, and which was plugged into a phone line, or a DSL line, and it was used on your desktop computer or a laptop. Most of the time these two devices, and very rarely you might have used it on your phone. But the thing is, the phone internet was bad, and the browsers weren't optimized for, or rather the sites weren't optimized for the browsers, the primitive browsers that existed on those earlier generation of mobile phones, which were not smartphones. And the vast majority of phone apps didn't like involve any web services, and when they did, they were very poor and very like these phone apps back then were used very little, because the phones just weren't that powerful. So it was kind of difficult to use, and people didn't like using them. So that was the first difference on how it was used. So it was almost always on your desktop computer, whereas now I'd say like there's a very large percentage of people who use the internet on their mobile devices, and that was just not a thing back then, really. At least not nearly as big as it is now. All right. So how did you connect to various sites that sort of were interesting to you in the old internet? Well, first of all, the search engines back then were quite primitive. So you could look things up, but the results you get weren't always what you wanted. So especially when you looked for like specific things in your own language, so rather than in English. And if it wasn't an international site that you were looking for, and you were looking for, like, let's say you're Swedish and you were looking for a service in Sweden, or a site in Sweden, and that was entirely in Swedish, you might have had like a significantly difficult time finding it with the search engines that were available back then. Of course, Google progressively like changed it, because it became so so powerful of a search engine. But generally, oftentimes when I was younger, I learned of various websites that I used. I just learned from them from like PC magazines for one, and for two from my friends. The vast majority of sites that I used, I learned actually from my friends. They told me, there's this site and there's that site, and this here you can download these demo games, and on this other site you can like find guides for, and then there's this third site that shows what's on television and stuff like that. And I sort of wrote them down on paper, and then I went to typed in the address, www. Whatever it is .com, and that's how I sort of found a lot of sites that I ended up using. And the other way that you learned of various sites was through these web forums, which were usually centered around either hobbies or sort of expert topics. So expert topics would, in this context, would of course be something like software development or something like that, and then hobbies, PC gaming was a hobby that obviously that I had when I was younger, and I still play some games, but generally speaking, I was quite into that community, and I learned of some sites, especially that had like walkthrough guides for games and stuff like that. I learned a lot of that sort of things I learned the addresses of those sites from those forums. And aside from that, I'd like to talk about a little of how how content was shared on the early internet. So you oftentimes went on like these services like IRC, and then you could share files there, and it was very anarchic. It was a very peer-to-peer type of thing. So you as an individual had some file, and then you shared it to another person, and that way that's type of it wasn't a centralized thing. Like it wasn't even how now we have this. Now you can sort of, if you do file sharing, there's like torrents and all sorts of different types of way. Those existed back then, but they weren't. They only started becoming popular at around halfway point of what I now talk about, the old internet. And before that, it was very much the peer-to-peer type of file sharing. So you got some very interesting old content, for example, from some various people that were willing to share that. And there was these sort of services like there was this service called DC Direct Connect, which was exactly this type of peer-to-peer service, and you could find all sorts of content there, which isn't really even well represented today in the file sharing scheme in the in the torrent world, etc. And you could find that sort of thing in the old internet quite easily if you use some of these services. So apart from that, let's talk a little bit more about the content. So this is actually a big thing, because I've been sort of wondering about how I should talk about this. But this type of sort of erotic/sexual content that you now see on the internet all the time. So you see it on just mainstream sites. You see it on like Instagram and social media sites in general. You didn't really come across that, because I'm not saying it didn't exist. Of course it existed, but it was sort of contained in these sketchy sites that sort of existed. But that wasn't really such a big thing, especially in the earlier days of the internet. Again, it was sort of a sidetrack. So if you really wanted to search that kind of content, of course you would find it, but now it is sort of pushed on you by these new centralized platforms. So you can't really avoid it. So if you use one of these platforms like Instagram, etc., you will see these influencers, etc., who post constant like revealing photos of them and videos of themselves, and you can't really avoid it as much as you could back in the old internet, where it was just these select sketchy sites that that sort of provided that type of content. So now it is thrown in your face everywhere on the internet, and so that's a big change in my opinion, because when I was younger, I could go for months and months using the internet, just casually visiting the forums and all sorts of sites that I used for like game content and social content, and talk to other people on those forums, etc., and buying and selling things on these various platforms that were offering that sort of service. And I could go for months without seeing any erotic material whatsoever. Like any, I didn't have like boobs shoved into my face at all. And if you wanted to find that sort of content, you had to like search for it from these sketchy sites. So it wasn't in your face at all. So that was a big difference. That's a big difference between how the content on the internet is today compared to how it was back then. And that content existed outside of the main sites that I was using and that my friends were using. But now it is on these social networks, these centralized social networks that are the main sites. So that's a big difference. That's a big difference. And it's not necessarily. I don't like it. I don't want I don't want things shoved down my throat. So generally speaking, I don't use a lot of those services because of that. At least not like actively. And well, it's not just because of that, of course, but that is one of the reasons. And then I would like to say that the websites back in the old internet were less visually appealing. So they were much more geared towards, I would say, functionality. So you had a lot of like little things that you would do to customize your experience. Whereas now, because the mobile devices are so, all these services are so geared towards the mobile experience, the functionality has been reduced a lot, unless you specifically search for that sort of extended functionality in the on the 59th page of settings in some app or something. So the sites are in a way much less complex than they used to be, and you have in a way you have less choice now than you used to have, and then I would like to talk about the users. So the users of the old internet were mostly men and boys, and this type of tech experts and experts in general, I would say, just scientists and people like that, they were overrepresented, like significantly overrepresented in almost any community that you entered on the internet, because they were the ones who had like early, how should I say this, they were like early adopters of the internet. Tech people, of course, because they were like involved with developing various services and producing content for the early internet and stuff like that. So of course they were overrepresented. So that's not surprising. But scientists also, because they were sharing information with each other, so the old internet had this type of demographic it wasn't a general crosscut of society, but it had this very specific demographic that was the vast majority of the users on the early internet. So those are basically some of the differences that I can easily find. But of course there are other differences in addition to these differences. But I would say that actually I want to circle back a little bit about the content on the websites and web services. And say one more thing about that, and that is that even though today you can say that the main sites are have less functionality and less choice, overall, however, there are more sites now than there ever were before. So in that sense, there is still more choice. It's just that the mass of people are basically using these services, which are very, very close to monopolies, and there's very little choice on those services and platforms, and that's a big difference in my opinion also. But yeah, that's basically my thoughts on the old internet, the age of anarchy on the internet, and it's definitely come to an end now, like a while ago already, and we are living in a very different reality. So let's get used to that, I guess.